The moment those 11 words sliced through courtroom 73, the illusion didn't crack, it detonated. Not with shouting, not with scandalous theatrics, but with the judge's calm, surgical voice reading a private instruction that no husband should ever hear about himself, encourage him to shed tears whenever he talks about Diana. And just like that, the air shifted. The courtroom stopped being a courtroom. It became a crime scene, not of law, but of love. Because sitting there, rigid in the witness box, wasn't just a prince. It was a man who built his entire rebellion, his entire identity on the sacred grief of losing his mother Diana, Princess of Wales, and now that grief was being described as a performance note. Prince Harry, the Prince Harry who had once walked behind his mother's coffin under the cold gaze of the world, didn't react at first. He froze. A military spine that had survived Afghanistan stiffened, then subtly buckled. His jaw clenched so hard it trembled. The knuckles of his hands resting on black trousers drained of color. It wasn't anger. It wasn't outrage. It was recognition. The kind that creeps in slow and suffocating when you realize the script you believed was your life might have been written by someone else. The lawsuit was supposed to be about press intrusion. It was meant to be another chapter in Harry's crusade against the British media, the machine he blamed for hounding his mother and, later, his wife. But as the defense began reading private messages allegedly sent by Meghan Markle, the narrative pivoted. The case transformed from Harry versus the press into something far more intimate and far more brutal. Harry versus the possibility that his own vulnerability had been curated, coached, even choreographed. One message described a public appearance as a gold mine of reactive content. Another discussed baking empathy into his next speech. But it was that chilling directive about Diana that cracked the room open. Because Diana is not just a memory. She is a national myth, a wound that never fully healed for Britain, and an emotional North Star for both her sons, including Prince William. For Harry especially, she has always been the heartbeat behind his rage, his rebellion, his relentless insistence that history would not repeat itself. So when the judge read those words, not shouted, not dramatized, simply stated, it reframed everything. It suggested that the most sacred trauma of his life might not have been solely a source of private agony, but a strategic lever, a tool, a narrative asset. And then came the next line that turned whispers into gasps. He wears grief like silk. Now all we need is the appropriate illumination. Silk, not sorrow. Not devastation. Silk, something textured, something aesthetic, something to be draped and lit for effect. The implication wasn't that Harry's grief was fake, it was worse than that. It implied that it was useful. The courtroom cameras caught it. His face folded inward. The defiance that once powered interviews, documentaries, and memoir confessions seemed to drain away. He bowed his head heavy as if gravity itself had increased. When he covered his face with both hands, it wasn't the composed vulnerability of a televised sit-down. It was raw, guttural. A sound tore out of him, unfiltered, unroyal. For a split second, no one moved. Not the barristers, not the journalists, not even the judge. Because what unfolded wasn't legal theater. It was existential collapse. A man realizing that the castle he built to escape one institution might have been another kind of structure entirely. Crafted, calculated, curated. The defense pressed on. They read messages allegedly advising on pacing during interviews, where to pause for emotional effect, when to glance down, when to rub his fingers while mentioning strained relationships. They referenced his now infamous appearance with Oprah Winfrey, pointing to annotations that described inserting breath before certain revelations, spacing out admissions about family rifts. What millions of viewers once interpreted as spontaneous vulnerability now appeared, at least in these transcripts, as something rehearsed, workshopped, fine-tuned. Harry didn't argue. He didn't explode. He sat there as if someone had peeled back his skin and pinned it to the wall. His attorney requested a break, citing extreme mental anguish. The judge declined at first. The machine of justice, like the monarchy itself, does not pause for tears. Message after message was read aloud. Discussions about monetizing trauma arcs, about pacing disclosures to avoid trauma fatigue, about stretching the royal narrative across multiple projects to maintain long-term relevance. The language sounded less like pillow talk and more like brand strategy. And then the most devastating message surfaced, the one that silenced even the most cynical reporters. He is still still looking for their recognition. It is pitiful, but I can make use of it. The remorse he feels about his mother makes it simple to refocus him. That is the power source. Power source. That phrase didn't just sting, it obliterated. Because if Diana was the power source, then Harry wasn't just a grieving son, he was fuel, a narrative engine, something to be directed. He didn't cry this time, he flinched, hard, like a physical blow landed. When he lifted his eyes, something had shifted. The fire that once animated his rebellion looked extinguished. Not anger, not even betrayal, just vacancy. The kind that comes when your internal map dissolves and you're left staring at a blank horizon. Behind palace walls, silence reigned. Buckingham Palace issued no triumphant statements. King Charles III reportedly called it a sad moment for all families. No gloating, no leaks, just controlled stillness. But privately, the shockwaves were seismic. For William, the alleged strategic analysis of family members as narrative assets cut deep. Catherine described in messages as the uncrackable mask. Charles assessed as sentimental leverage. Even the children discussed in terms of branding optics. The public response ignited like wildfire. In the UK, approval ratings for the Sussexes reportedly plummeted. In the US, their chosen refuge, talk shows pivoted from praise to psychological panels dissecting the language of control. Online, a hashtag surged, hashtag Harry deserves better. The narrative flipped. The rebel prince who once seemed complicit in attacking his family was suddenly reframed as a man potentially caught inside something far more sophisticated than palace rigidity, emotional choreography. Trauma specialists described what he might be experiencing as reality dissolution, the shattering realization that intimate moments, therapy confessions, even nightmares about tunnels and helicopters might have been cataloged not solely for healing, but for storytelling. And that is where the true devastation lies. Not in contracts, not in headlines, but in the quiet horror of wondering which memories were yours and which were strategically positioned. When court recessed for 30 minutes, Harry left the witness box not as a victorious crusader, not as a defiant exile, but as a man stripped bare by evidence he never expected to hear out loud. The rebellion that once looked like liberation now hung suspended between two possibilities. Either he was a willing co-architect of the narrative machine, or he was its most valuable component. And as he returned to his seat, eyes dimmed and movement slow, the question lingered heavier than any legal argument. If your grief becomes someone else's strategy, who are you without it? When the court resumed, something fundamental had shifted in the man sitting in that witness box. The firebrand prince who once declared war on the British press now looked like someone walking through the ruins of his own certainty. His eyes were rimmed red, but dry. His movements were slower, deliberate, as though every gesture required conscious effort. The emotional storm had passed, but what remained was worse. Silence. Not the dignified silence of royalty. The hollow silence of a man recalculating his entire reality. The defense organized the evidence into three chilling categories: monetization, family manipulation, and emotional exploitation. And with each category, the structure of the Sussex narrative, that carefully constructed fortress of authenticity, began to look less like refuge and more like architecture. Under monetization, messages allegedly broke down emotional storylines into income streams. Diana's legacy described as halo, tension with William as comparison vector, Charles framed as redemption thread, the Netflix deal referenced as a pension vehicle. There were discussions of pacing disclosures to prevent trauma fatigue, of stretching the royal saga across multiple projects to ensure sustained relevance. It wasn't just business strategy, it was emotional inventory, grief quantified, family conflict segmented, sympathy scheduled. For a brand built on the promise of raw truth, this language detonated like dynamite, because authenticity cannot survive the perception of choreography. Once vulnerability looks rehearsed, once tears seem timed, the currency collapses. And then came family manipulation. Messages allegedly describing Prince William as the real threat due to institutional loyalty. Catherine, Princess of Wales, referred to as the uncrackable mask. King Charles III assessed as sentimental leverage. Even reconciliation framed as a potential strategic pivot if the brand required softening. Chess pieces, not relatives. The most unsettling part wasn't the criticism. Families fight, brothers feud, fathers disappoint. But here, the transcript suggested something colder, an evaluation grid, strengths, weaknesses, emotional entry points. When the judge read the note about Harry missing his brother and being quickly redirected, the air thickened. He was veering off course, not supported, not comforted, redirected. Harry's face drained of color. For years, the narrative had framed him as the one who chose distance, who prioritized his wife over blood. But what if the currents were more complex? What if longing had been treated not as healing, but as liability? The third category, emotional exploitation, was the one that seemed to hollow him out completely. Therapy sessions referenced, night terrors cataloged, tunnel dreams about his mother noted. Strong for the book. Imagine sitting there while your worst fears are read back to you not as private struggles but as potential chapters. This wasn't just about business, it was about agency. Because if someone else was framing your trauma, shaping its presentation, timing its exposure, then where did your authentic self end and the narrative begin? Across the Atlantic, the reaction intensified. In Britain, approval ratings reportedly plummeted. In America, the land of reinvention talk shows that once celebrated their courage began inviting psychologists to analyze the language of coercive influence. A streaming executive was quoted anonymously saying, "We purchased a memoir, not a manipulation handbook." Corporate deals reportedly went into review. The Sussex brand, constructed on survivor storytelling, faced what analysts called a credibility crisis. On social media, the tide turned abruptly. #HarryDeservesBetter trended worldwide. The same public that once accused him of betrayal began reframing him as potentially entrapped in something far more sophisticated than palace rigidity, emotional engineering. Mental health experts used a phrase that echoed across broadcasts: reality dissolution. The psychological shock of realizing the person you trusted most may have been curating your emotional world. Behind palace walls, Buckingham Palace maintained disciplined silence. The official line from Clarence House was restrained, a sad moment for families. No triumph, no revenge. But insiders suggested complexity beneath that stillness. Charles reportedly extended a quiet olive branch, not for a public return, but for private healing. The institution has rules, but a father does not. William, according to those close to him, felt something different. Anger not just at Meghan, but at Harry. He let her do this. The perception that Harry participated in strategic discussions about his own family cut deeper than any interview accusation ever had. And so the prince now stands at a fork in the most public road imaginable. Option 1, stay. Attempt to rebuild a marriage under the shadow of transcripts suggesting calculated direction. That path demands superhuman forgiveness and the willingness to believe that strategy and love can coexist without contamination. Option 2, leave. A divorce battle across California courts. Custody disputes over children whose titles and security would ignite constitutional questions. The world watching every fouling. Option 3, return, not to the front balcony, not to ribbon cuttings, but to the private fold. To be Harry, not the Duke. To heal under the roof of the very institution he once condemned. Each path carries humiliation. Each demands confession, either to himself, to the public, or to his family. And here is the cruelest twist. The rebellion that was supposed to free him may have locked him inside something more intricate than palace protocol. Because while monarchy is rigid and ancient emotional choreography is invisible, it feels like choice. It feels like authenticity. Until evidence suggests otherwise. When Harry finally exited the courtroom that day, there was no dramatic speech. No clenched fist defiance. Just a man moving carefully, as if the ground beneath him might fracture again at any step. The world once saw him as the prince who shattered tradition to protect his wife. Now it sees a more fragile possibility. A son whose grief, the grief of Diana, Princess of Wales, may have been both his shield and his vulnerability. History will debate the authenticity of the transcripts. Lawyers will argue context. Publicists will strategize damage control. But none of that erases the image of a man flinching as his most sacred pain was described as the power source. That phrase lingers like smoke, because if grief is the engine and someone else holds the steering wheel, then what remains of sovereignty? Not royal sovereignty, personal sovereignty. The House of Windsor has survived abdications, affairs, divorces, scandals. But this was not about constitutional crisis. It was about narrative crisis, about the possibility that the modern monarchy's most human chapter, a son mourning his mother, may have been reframed as content. And somewhere between the palace and California, between rebellion and refuge, Prince Harry now faces the most brutal reckoning of all, determining whether the life he built was liberation or another gilded cage constructed not of stone and ceremony, but of strategy and spotlight. The courtroom is quiet now. The transcripts are public. The illusion, once seamless, is fractured. What shatters next is no longer controlled by judges, headlines, or hashtags. It is controlled by one man deciding who he is when the script falls away.